Hi there. Welcome to Industry Hurdles 2024. I'm Mark Hobick. I'm the Executive Vice President of Luminate and Head of Film and TV. Today, we are going to be having a rollicking and exciting conversation around the hurdles facing the global film industry today. Let me introduce our panel. I have a longtime friend and colleague, Andy. The last time you and I presented together, we were at Informa in January. Andy is the president and chief media analyst for Variety VIP. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
And Julie Sesnovich. Julie is a film analyst here with Luminate Film and TV and has been with the organization for 8 years.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here as well.
So glad to be here.
Really appreciate it. Okay. Let's start out with the strike impact. And, when I think back to late last year when we were doing our financial planning, our expectation was that certainly the dual strikes were very significant and we would feel an impact into Q1. And I think a lot of organizations planned for that. What we didn't expect, and I think what surprised the industry, was that the impact we would still be feeling today in August. And that impact is quite acute. What you're looking at here are the films impacted by the Hollywood strikes, the dual strikes, by distributor. And you see here on the left, Warner Brothers with 16 releases, theatrical releases, 1 streaming, Disney with 14, 2 streaming, etc. My question for you, Julie, is how is it that the strikes which wrapped up last fall, are still impacting film today?
Sure. So with TV production, it's obviously very cyclical. It works on a much shorter cycle. Film production, it's all over the place. So the impact can be felt for a very long time because there can be a number of disruptions. One is obviously just production schedule, like The Batman. They had to bump that because they haven't made it yet. It hasn't shot yet. You also run into actor availability, location availability, director availability. Someone who's available no longer is. Publicity, you have actors unavailable to do the publicity because of the strike, something gets bumped. Then you also start to see the domino effect of if one movie takes another one's release date and that one takes another one's release date. And, ultimately those ripple effects can be felt for years.
Right. And, during the strikes, I think largely the actor availability or unavailability to do those kind of A-list actor promotions of films really impacted those productions as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. That was a major reason they bumped Dune, because they're like, we need Zendaya and Timothée Chalamet out here stumping for this, and if they can't, it's not worth it. So they bumped it to March.
Right. Let's move forward, and here we're actually looking at part of the study where we're looking at weekly wide release films, and this is over a 2-year period when you look at this graph. So, Andy, I want to ask you and Julie, so when we look at the second half of the year, where do we think the global box office is going to shake out? And let me just say, when we look at 2024, every month of 2024 thus far has been under 2023. We know the vast majority of box office revenue, over half, comes in the summer. The summer is quickly passing by. And with Deadpool, Wolverine, the Disney Marvel piece, is that enough to catch up? And where are we going to shake out? Andy, you want to start off?
Yeah. First of all, I do have to correct you, though. I do believe in 1 month, I believe it was March, where actually 2024 is not behind 2023.
Okay.
However, largely, yes, it is a question of lagging. And, it's weird because we're just coming off 2 months right now at the box office where Hollywood's looking great. Great performance after great performance, lots of franchises. You mentioned Deadpool, Inside Out 2. You would think that there's no problems here. However, because of what we were just talking about with the strike, for other reasons, there's just fewer big movies, particularly in the superhero genre, I should point out. And therefore, despite the fact that we've seen great strides these past 2 months, we're still going to see a box office that is down from the previous year. I would estimate if right now we're down, I'd say about 20%. That's probably where it's going to net out, probably domestically. Globally, I would imagine it's going to look like the same, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it may not track out to be the same, but I do think there are reasons for optimism here. I think given all that's happened with the strikes and the pandemic, I think, the studios have managed to cobble together a pretty decent slate for the back half of this year. I mean, you have a ton of sequels. You have sequels to Smile and The Lion King and Sonic the Hedgehog and Venom: The Last Dance. And then you also have, everyone's wondering what the next Barbenheimer is going to be. Can we replicate Barbenheimer? And we may find out on November 22nd when Wicked Part 1 and Gladiator Part 2 release the same day, or as people are calling it, Glicked. We'll see if that catches on.
And don't forget what I think is the biggest one of all, Joker. Joker
Oh, yeah.
2. We saw how big the first one was, and that could, I think that's my pick for what has the biggest upside potential in the latter half of the year.
And even looking beyond the tent poles, like this weekend is going to see the release of It Ends With Us, which is based on a massive, massive hit book. It's tracking crazy high. It would be hilarious if Blake Lively dethroned Ryan Reynolds at the box office. But outside of that, it's like hits can come from all over. So it may end up being less, but you also have to bear in mind, last year was a huge bumper crop because so many pandemic delayed projects kind of all wound up in 2023. So I think 2023 was also kind of an above average year. So comparing to last year, you are going to see that dip.
Right, right. Okay. And that actually segues really nicely into our next slides here, studio films by year. So, what you're looking at here are really a 6-year time frame and the major distributors here, the major studios. When we look at them, you can see from left to right that in 2019, now in 2024, we're seeing fewer films than in 2019, but in fact, seeing fewer films than we did in 2023. My question to both of you is, how has the type and frequency of film changed, and what's driving that over this period going forward?
Well, as I referenced earlier, 2024 is notable by the utter lack of superhero movies, which I think to some degree was actually a good thing, given we saw a serious case of burnout in 2023. Deadpool is showing, though, that this path is still viable, and we're going to see Disney in particular, I think, is going to come back in a very big way there. But I think there's still other genres to talk about. Julie, what is catching your eye?
Yeah, obviously horror has been a huge growth area for every studio. At this point, it seems like they're surprised every time a horror movie does well, to the point where maybe it's not a surprise anymore. Maybe
Right.
horror just overperforms. It's cheap to make, it's very popular, it can be marketed very effectively. So I think that's a huge growth area for even the major studios.
But I'm also, before Longlegs, which succeeded very nicely this summer, there were actually a bunch of horror movies that did not perform too well. So I'm still a little shaky, pardon the pun, on horror movies. We've got a few more coming out in the coming weeks that I want to keep an eye on. I'm a little scared, there I go again, about the state of that genre. But it's nowhere, let's put it this way, it's doing a hell of a lot better than something like comedy where it's over.
Well, let me ask you this, though, because when we look at what's driving this change, one of the strategies we see is particularly around significant IP libraries like Star Wars. We did a newsletter a few weeks ago where we really talked about the uneven consumption that we're seeing around Star Wars titles. When you have a strategy, when you're releasing series, television series, how does that impact the film releases? Because it feels like with Star Wars, Disney has learned something from Marvel.
Yes, but I think Disney's got a big problem because the strategy was, instead of putting all these pieces of Star Wars IP in theaters, they decided to funnel it into Disney Plus, which made sense. The problem is, as Luminate data indicated, diminishing returns on some of these latest projects. And the problem is if you're coming back to the theaters, as I believe they've got Jon Favreau directing the next big theatrical, I believe for 2026, they've got to whet appetites on Disney Plus to get people back to the theater. So if they're not doing that well on Disney Plus, that's a problem for the theatrical business.
Yeah, I think it's, as other people have noted, I think Star Wars got maybe oversaturated. Like, there was a period for many decades when a Star Wars movie was an event. like a huge event. And it started to become almost like an annual occurrence, like it came every year like tax day, and that's no fun, right? So, you know, they retreated from theatrical, they started doing all these series on Disney Plus, but again, they're uneven, and a TV series is a much longer time commitment than a movie. So then people got bogged down in continuity, and they're just like, it's a lot. It's a lot for people to keep on top of, and it can either, as you said, whet appetites and keep people excited or wear them down.
But while we're smacking Disney around here, we have to be very clear in pointing out that on the movie side, Disney is very much a comeback story, a success story. Yes, I think they've got a looming problem on the Star Wars side, but on the Marvel side, obviously they've just proved things in a huge way with Deadpool. But, you know, Bob Iger came back to Disney with a big mandate to rebuild the movie side. He just signed up the Russo brothers to do some more Avengers. He's got Robert Downey Jr. coming back in. That's what he's supposed to do. So while we've got some issues on the Star Wars side, on the Marvel side, he is loaded and ready to go, and that's exactly what Disney needs to do.
Okay. That sort of dovetails very nicely into this next piece from the study. So what we're looking at here are the most expensive theatrical films released between 2019 and 2023. What you'll notice here that's interesting is that all of these except for are Disney films. Now, these are films that had $200 million plus production budgets. So we're not talking about the marketing spend, but specifically around the production. Andy, what I'd like to kind of lean into a little bit is, why do you feel like Disney is dominating so much here? And when we look at the other studios who are really underrepresented, is that because they've been more focused on investing in their streaming operations at the expense of these big budget films? Why do we see Disney so dominant here?
I don't think it's really anything different than this business, to some extent, has always been a bit of Disney, and then there's everyone else, particularly at the high end of the biggest blockbusters. And look, it's not as if the other studios right now don't have their success stories to tell, but they're not playing at quite the same scale. I think we'll see over at Warner Brothers, at DC, they're in the middle of ramping back up. That's going to come back in a big way. But I don't know that necessarily at Paramount or at Sony, they're playing at that same level. I don't even know if it's really a matter of streaming. I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting with Disney is they have been in the tentpole business for a very long time now. And in fact, after they acquired Fox, there's really less incentive for them to kind of traffic in small and mid-budget films, because now they own Fox, they own New Regency, they own Searchlight, which has great track records for that kind of films. So they kind of just stuck in the tentpole lane. And I actually looked this up this morning because I wondered if this was something. It turns out in the last 10 years, with the exception of Young Woman in the Sea, which was developed for Disney Plus, there have only been 5 scripted theatrical Disney films that cost under $100 million in the last 10 years. And the most recent one was 6 years ago. So I think, listen, no matter which Bob is in charge, this is like a long-time corporate strategy of theirs. And I think especially with like the Fox divisions kind of trafficking in the more mid-budget stuff, it's like, why wouldn't they do this, you know? Some
Right.
hit, some don't, but it's kind of their business.
Yeah. So this next slide is the most expensive streaming films. Now, same period we're looking at. Now, many of these films, I believe most of them, were released in theaters as well. However, again, you're looking at $200 million budgets. So my question here is, how are the streamers measuring success with budgets like this?
I don't think we're going to see these. I think this is movies from a particular era, and it's not going to be happening ever again. Movies like this are going to theatrical, period.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these were developed for theaters and were a last-minute COVID pivot. I mean, I don't think anyone was happy they put Wonder Woman 1984 on streaming. I don't think they were happy they put Mulan on streaming, but I think they felt they had no choice. So yeah, and to answer your question of how can you measure the success, you kind of can't, which is the challenge. You know, with theatrical films, you get a dollar amount. You say, this made this much money. With streaming, you can, of course, measure how many people are watching, but you can't assign a dollar amount to that. You can't prove directly this, you know, encouraged this many new subscribers, this maintained this many subscribers. So and that's kind of the existential question at the heart of streaming that I think investors and subscribers and companies are starting to say, we need answers now.
Right, right. Well,
you know?
and I think that's also part of the space that Luminate sits in, which is providing data that's going to support answering those questions, particularly around streaming. What's the value of a stream? What's the value of individual watching a series in terms of churn and subscriber growth? So yeah, but it's much more complicated than measuring box office. Okay, let's move on to large format screens. So this is a really interesting part of the study. And on the left, you see this green infographic. So about 2.5% of the global screens in cinema are large format screens. When we look at something like Oppenheimer generated about 20% of its box office revenue from these large format screens. So my question, and Andy, I'll start with you, is, you know, are the large format screens central to the strategy of getting people back in theaters? And then kind of bonus round on this is, if either of you had any exposure to 4D, what that's like, I think that'd be interesting for people to hear.
I mean, I think, first of all, that 20% Oppenheimer number will always be perhaps the ceiling. I don't think that's easily replicable, but I think part and parcel of every respectable, true blockbuster is going to have to be a great performance on PLFs. And I think you saw that recently with Twisters. I think you saw that recently with Deadpool. Where IMAX and these other more expensive formats go is where the industry goes. I think this is absolutely the future of the business. Now, I'm not paying for this. I have yet to see the true value differential in what limited experience I've had with these formats. What's your experience been like?
So I'm very pro, you know, premium format. I think the premium format landscape looks very different now than it even did a few years ago, and I think there's two reasons for that. The first one is that filmmakers are incorporating it into the filmmaking process. It's no longer just like a gimmick they tack on at the end. They're saying, let's shoot for IMAX, let's shoot for Dolby, let's shoot on 70 millimeter, and this is part of the creative process. So instead of just a gimmick at the end, you're getting it as part of their creative vision. And
So not like 3D.
Well, yeah, some people shoot for 3D, but I think, again, audiences are savvy and they can tell the difference, right? So I think the other thing is those filmmakers then become evangelists for that format, and the messaging has never been clearer. I'll use the example of my in-laws in suburban Oregon, who know very little about the movie business. I mean, bless them, but they don't. And
They should be watching this.
I know.
They don't know.
I know, but last summer, they told me, they were like, you gotta see Oppenheimer in 70 millimeter. And when pressed, they didn't even know what that meant. They just knew it was important. So like the message is reaching everyone. And you're seeing that with Dune as well. I mean, IMAX screenings of Dune Part 2 were so popular that they just kept adding them and adding them. There was a theater in New York City that had a screening at 3 a.m. that was almost full. So the message is getting out there in a way that it never has. And I will say there are a lot of fake IMAX screens out there. So have you gone to the City Walk one?
No.
Okay, go to City Walk, see a movie shot for IMAX in IMAX at City Walk, and then get back to me, because that is a whole other experience.
Okay, Julie, but what about, here we are having the conversation the day after we're getting indicators that the global economy could be tipping into a recession, and I'm wondering about Joe average consumer and whether they're going to have the stomach to be spending, upwards of $17, $18 on tickets for what I still think, and maybe I got to go to the City Walk, is not a clearly defined value differential from the normal ticket.
And for a family of 4, it gets very expensive. If
right.
you have kids and yeah.
Of course, but the thing about the large formats too is they get the infrequent moviegoers because it's an event. Like people who rarely go to the theaters say, if I'm going to go to the theaters once this year, it's going to be an event, and they go see it in IMAX.
And but if I'm IMAX, I really want to be more than a special event. I want people to be going more regularly. And that's in the growth of the company. I'm sure they want to see that transition, but interesting. That's fascinating. Let's move it forward and get into event releases. This is an area where Luminate really excels. Part of the data that Luminate provides is consumption data for music. Luminate is the company that powers the Billboard charts, and so we have a very unique perspective on recording artists, and that translates into top concert films at the box office. What you're looking at here are the top concert films, and this is everything from Taylor Swift's most recent tour to Madonna, Truth or Dare, the Jonas Brothers, etc. You see here how significant the revenue around Taylor Swift, the Eras Tour, was. Julie, I wonder if you can unpack a little bit for us what was so successful about this tour and what was unique about it.
Sure. I mean, well, what's unique is it's Taylor Swift. She's an industry unto herself, of course, so no one can ever replicate exactly what she does. But I think these concert films are on the rise because they're a huge win-win for everybody. You're filming an event that's happening anyway, costs basically nothing. In her case, and also with Beyonce, they made distribution deals directly with AMC, cut out the middleman, saved even more money. And then these concerts are expensive. They're hard to get tickets to. And so for fans of these artists, it's a much easier way to see their favorite artist in a communal environment. So, there's obviously been concert films in the past, kind of one-off, but I think after Taylor Swift did it so successfully, we may see more of them.
But Julie, are concert films on the rise? I was expecting to see at least a trickle follow Taylor, follow Beyonce, and I'm surprised we're not hearing more word of a pipeline developing behind the two of them, and I'm not quite sure why that is, because it would seem to make all the sense in the world, even if you're not necessarily at a Taylor Swift level. I mean, you look at the data in live entertainment, either she or Beyonce are far from the only success story in the concert business right now.
Right.
So why aren't we seeing more artists parlay that success in the film business? I don't get it.
Yeah.
I mean, we might. The thing is, a lot of them announce very late. Like I think she only announced this movie like a couple months before it came out, and so many other movies scrambled and changed their release date as a result.
But that was a long time ago. I just feel like we should have seen more activity since then.
Right, and I think it's worth mentioning that this was unique in that AMC really got in front of this at the right time. They brokered this deal with Variance, I think. And what's interesting is, there are very few companies that can measure those trends, in terms of identifying when an artist is really peaking, where their career is, and enthusiasm for that. So I think and I'm going out on a limb here, but for the major exhibitors, really referring to the data can benefit them. Okay, with that, Andy, let's talk a little bit about some other ways that exhibitors are bringing in non-traditional content. I saw actually in Variety today that Cat Video Fest, 73 minutes of film, hundreds of cinemas around the world, packing or filling up somewhat some of these cinemas, let's say. What are some other types of non-traditional content we're seeing?
I would not have guessed cat videos.
People love cats.
Sure, don't know why they can't do that in the comfort of their own homes, but I guess as a communal event, there's something to be said there. Yeah. The Olympics, by the way, has been something that has been turned into a communal event at theaters. Some select AMC theaters broadcast some of the bigger events, bringing people together. That makes sense. There is a ton of things that can be done and have been done. the exhibitors, I think it's critical to the future of that business that they, and my God, I mean, for me to be talking about this in 2024, I mean, they were talking about this in 2004. Figure out more consistent alternatives to using their space 24/7 than just showing first-run movies. And I can't believe I'm still talking about this now.
Well, let's keep talking about it because our next piece of this study was on focusing specifically on Fathom Events, which is a distributor that really specializes in non-traditional content in cinemas, everything from Broadway to Met Opera, sporting events, etc. Julie, can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of this type of content? What's driving this type of viewing?
Sure. So Fathom Events is fascinating because they're targeting so many separate niches that have nothing in common except that they're a fan of something and they want to see it with other fans. So you have Christian content, you have opera, you have anime. Like there's very little connective tissue except the desire for people to see this on a big screen. So it's a model that can be replicated. It's just hard to kind of force it because again, you do have to tap into existing fan bases.
Right.
So I definitely, like when I go to the movies, I see all kinds of like Fathom Events trailers for just all kinds of stuff now. There's a lot of like influencers and like social media personalities kind of getting into this game. I mean, I think it's kind of a low risk, low cost, high reward model. So I think Fathom is maybe starting to experiment with more of the possibilities.
Right. And it may also speak to a little bit of, we know people feel more isolated than ever. Sure. Having these events that are communal around a shared passion or interest, getting you all into one space, it's scratching an itch for people.
Sure.
For sure. Okay. On that note, let's move forward into best original streaming. So this is something that Luminate excels in. We launched a product last July, Streaming Viewership M, which measures, among other things, 2.5 million smart TVs and all of their viewing habits on those televisions. What you're looking at in this slide are the most viewed original films per streamer. So each one of these was the top performer in the time frame, January 1st, 2022 through April 2024. You see Disney Plus on top, turning red. This is animated. This is children's. There's a lot of repeat viewing when we look at children's, which would explain some of that big number. But most of these films were released in 2022. My question is, Andy, let me send this to you. How has the streaming landscape changed since these were released?
Well, I think we've seen that the studios have undergone an evolution in thinking about how they're using the streamers. And now that we have gotten past, COVID and the strikes, there is now more of a reliance on the traditional models. They want to give theatrical everything it's got. And I think the last 2 months have given them a renewed faith in that. And so will the streamers be poorer for it? Not necessarily, because I think there is plenty of genres of movies that are not going to work in theatrical, that there are plenty of lanes for the streamers to play. We saw recently, for instance, the reboot of Beverly Hills Cop coming back. I don't think there was any chance a movie like that was going to work in theatrical. I think romantic comedies will always be a tough sell. Yes, we saw Fly Me to the Moon, Apple TV Plus, put that in theaters, gave it a good chance to catch on, and I don't think they necessarily saw that that was going to be the theatrical hit that they wanted it to be, which was really about also driving momentum back towards the Apple platform. So, look, I think there is room for both a theatrical and a streaming film business because what works on one doesn't necessarily work on the other.
Yeah. Let me double click on Netflix for a second, Julie, and this is right in your wheelhouse. When we look at these are the films released in the same period on Netflix. the top performing films. When we look at these films, now these were all released under Scott Stuber. Dan Lin has now taken the reins over at Netflix. How do we expect Netflix to change going forward under Dan Lin?
Sure. I mean, obviously, we don't totally know yet because he only got the job a few months ago. But he has made clear, as have some other streamers, that the old machine gun approach of let's try everything for all the money is not going to fly anymore. They're definitely trying to take a more surgical, more judicious approach going forward. And if you look at some of these original films, part of the reason these are so expensive is star salaries. Like, you have to pay these stars so much money to account for the fact that they can't get residuals. So Netflix has really trafficked in that model, and it has had some success, obviously, but I think Dan Lin is like, let's slow down, let's take a beat, let's really evaluate these on a more case-by-case basis instead of just flinging everything against the wall.
I'm sure Scott Stuber will. I'm picturing now him as Rambo, machine gun, like that. Which, by the way, no knock on him, but I think he came at an earlier part in the Netflix evolution where it was about trying lots of different things.
It was a different company.
Yes.
It was a different ecosystem.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. This is our penultimate question. We want to really focus in, again, on streamers and that SVM data set, which is so rich and around genres. Now, what I love about this slide is it combines our streaming viewership metric data with our best-in-class metadata, and it allows us to begin to answer the question, what genres perform best on what platforms? It's incredibly valuable, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We have so many more genres and arenas that are represented, and to your point, Andy, that the streamers are really able to lean in on. So much of our conversation today has been around the rarefied air of tentpoles, very significant budgets. Yes, A24 and Neon have been successful in the independent space. However, when we are looking at this content, I want to read a quote to you from the Oscars earlier this year, and this is Cord Jefferson, who won the Oscar for Best Screenplay for American Fiction. He said, "I understand that this is a risk-averse industry. I get it. But $200 million movies are also a risk. And it doesn't always work out, but you take the risk anyway. Instead of making one $200 million movie, try making 20 $10 million movies or 50 $4 million movies." So my question is, and Julie, I'll start with you, in the next 5 years, where do the $4 to $10 million movies go?
Sure. So I actually, last month, I attended an event at the Academy where they had a Q&A with Christine Vachon, the indie super producer. She's been in the biz for decades. And she says people are always coming up to her and eulogizing independent film and being like, "Didn't you hear? Independent film is dead. Isn't that sad?" And she's like, people have been doing this for 30 straight years. Like, at a certain point, it's not true. And just because the industry evolves and changes doesn't mean it's dead. It's finding new opportunities. And in fact, since studios have kind of largely abandoned the mid and small budget space, there's a huge opportunity for indie film. I mean, we talked a little bit about Longlegs. That's a Neon movie that is about to eclipse the domestic box office gross of Furiosa, which is nuts. They ran a very successful campaign. It really clicked with people. And I just think there's always going to be a demand for new voices, for new talent, for new stories. And it's just about getting them in front of people. But I don't think you can, kill indie film. I don't think it's worth eulogizing. I think it will always be a factor, and there's a lot of opportunity.
Okay.
Even in the heat of the summer months, which of course is all about blockbuster, believe it or not, there's been, even at the theaters, some indie success stories. A small movie called Thelma, I forgot who the distributor is on it.
Magnolia, I believe.
Thanks. Has managed to break out of the pack. Not, 100 million or anywhere near that, but the fact that in this climate, any indie movie could just not outright fail, that could actually get discovered, it's really a great sign.
That's great. So I want to end on a high note. And before we do, I just want to remind everybody watching, please, if you have any questions, please submit them, and we'll be happy to answer them later when this is all wrapped. But my last question for both of you is, let's end on a high note. What are some successes that you're seeing? What gives us hope? What should we be looking forward to?
Do you want to start? Or are you not optimistic?
I'll let you go.
Okay, I'll grease the wheels. So I am seeing a lot of things that give me hope. One is the theatrical release of Anyone But You, the Glenn Powell and Sydney Sweeney rom-com from last December. So that was a Christmas release. It was a very crowded corridor, and it only made $8 million in its first weekend. But Sony, notably, is the only studio without a streaming service. So they said, hey, you know what? Let it cook. So it was in wide release for 15 straight weeks and ended up grossing close to $100 million just because they had patience. It turned into a huge viral thing on TikTok. People really responded to it. So I think that patience, if you're not trying to like shuttle something off to streaming, can be very rewarded. Also on kind of the financing end, there's a filmmaking team of Clint Bentley and Greg Cuidar. They have a film in theaters now called Sing Sing. It's very good. Go see it. They didn't pay me. They shoot their films with a very innovative financing model where everyone on set, every single person gets paid the same, and then everyone gets a stake in equity of the finished product. So it's a very low upfront cost. All of their films have turned a profit. And even Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, their company Artist Equity is kind of exploring a similar model. So for risk-averse financiers, that's kind of a sweet deal to present to them. And also just, again, I mentioned it briefly before, Barbenheimer. Like people have treated it like a unicorn and like, ooh, too bad that'll never happen again. And I'm like, wait a minute, let's look at why it happened and how it happened. And I think it's actually very simple. I think two very good filmmakers made two very good films. They marketed the hell out of them. And I think ultimately it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Like, is it easier said than done? Of course. But at the end of the day, good films marketed well, that is the backbone of the industry, you know?
Yeah, I love that. Andy?
And kind of following on the heels of that, I think we got to just step back and look at the big picture of 2024 at the theaters, which couldn't have started off worse. The first 5 months of the year were pretty bad. The summer started off pretty bad with some significant flops with The Fall Guy and Furiosa. But now look at what the last 2 months have reaped. It wasn't just Deadpool and Inside Out. There were like 5 or 6 franchises that, Twisters was not a guaranteed success. Despicable Me was a guaranteed success, but some other franchises were not. So, look, you could easily point to the last 2 months and say, look, this is the summer. This is when the audience is primed for these movies. This is when the best stuff is out there. Of course this is going to work. But you're taking for granted the fact that, we could have easily seen a bomb in these 2 months and did not. And that bodes really well for 2025. When we are out of the shadow of the strikes, we have a year with a normal amount of wide releases for 12 months. And so I think if you are a pessimist about the long-term prospects of the industry, and I think that pessimism is warranted, that's fine. But you have to reassess sort of the timetable for that pessimism, because I think 2025 is without question going to be a comeback year for this business.
Well, amen. That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Julie. This has been great talking to you both.
So nice to be here.
Thank you.